During my freshman year at ACU, I was living in the dorm, and I went down to visit the dorm room of an upperclassman. He was in a leadership position in the dorm. They called him a spiritual life advisor. His name was Scott McBride, and went down there to have a conversation. And looking back at that conversation now, I don't actually remember what we talked about. But what I do remember is being distracted by a painting on his wall. On his wall, he had a print of a painting by an artist named Jack Maxwell, and the painting depicted a picture of a lion looking a man square in the face. And it was a depiction of Daniel in the lion's den. And there was something real about it that grabbed my attention, the realistic nature of the painting. And I want to share part of that painting with you now. And I'm not going to show you, I've cut out the part that shows Daniel, because what I want you to do is personalize this painting a little bit. And this will be, what I'm going to ask you to do, it'll be easier for some of you and it'll be more difficult for others. But follow with me for a second as I ask you to do this. I would like for you to picture yourself in the painting, looking the lion square in the eye. That lion that is in the foreground, the male lion. And if you would, I would like for you to think of that male lion as a metaphor for whatever adversity you're facing in life right now. Think of that lion as representing any anxiety, any illness, any grief, relationship stress, or uncertainty that you are facing. Take about 30 seconds now and look at this picture. Imagine yourself in there looking the lion square in the face, and think of that lion as a metaphor for any adversity you're facing. When we think of the story of Daniel in the lion's den, it's easy to focus on what's happening right there, that day, in the lion's den. And that's a traumatic event, for sure. Even though we can think of it as a victory story, and we often tell it as a victory story because the angel came and shut the mouths of the lions and Daniel survived, it was traumatic for Daniel. But Daniel, that was not the first adversity he had faced. Daniel didn't grow up in Babylon, where the story of the lion's den takes place. He grew up in Jerusalem, as many of you already know. And when he was a young man living in Jerusalem, an army from Babylon came and invaded. And out of respect to the idea that you might have kids with you while you're watching the sermon there at home, I won't go into the details about what the Bible says happened when Babylon invaded Jerusalem, but Daniel had to survive the trauma of seeing all this destruction that took place there in Jerusalem. And there were only a small number of survivors, and Daniel was part of them. Part of the survivors they left behind in Jerusalem, the Babylonians did, they left them behind. And we read about what life is like for them in the book of Lamentations. But the other part of the survivors, the Babylonians took with them back to Babylon. And that's how Daniel got from Jerusalem to Babylon. And so that's one major trauma that Daniel has been through. Seeing the destruction, surviving it, and leaving what he is familiar, the life he's familiar with in Jerusalem, and going to Babylon, not by choice. The second thing is when he gets to Babylon, they mock him. They make life really difficult for him. The way that they mock him is they change his name to the name of a false god in order to poke fun at his faith and his devotion to the real God. And the government officials there hate him because of the success he's having. They don't like seeing this foreigner having so much success in their country, and so they leverage his devotion to God to plot to kill him. And that is how Daniel ends up in the lion's den. But it's important that we don't just think that Daniel's having a traumatic day because of the lion's den, Daniel's not just having an adverse season of life. Daniel is having an adverse life. Again, I would like for us to think about Daniel's time in the lion's den as a metaphor for our own lives, especially for times of adversity in our lives. Having faith in the lion's den can be difficult because during the most challenging seasons of life, it can feel like God has already abandoned us. So the question can be, where is this faith supposed to come from when bad things are already happening? When we're facing this adversity, when we've already been laid off from our job, when someone who we had deep feelings for broke up with us, when a spouse wants a divorce and doesn't want to work on the marriage, when we've received a frightening medical diagnosis, it can seem like faith is hard to come by because there we are in our metaphorical lion's den and something is already wrong. I'd like for you to take a moment now to think privately about this question, about a time in your life where you believe God intervened for you in the face of adversity. When was a season in life when you believe God stepped in? For some of you, answering that question may have been easy. You may have been able to come up with a time in your life when you felt God step in and acted rather quickly. For others of you, it may have been more difficult. And maybe all of us can think of a time when we wish God would have stepped in and acted, but we don't feel like he did, at least not in the way that we wanted. But God rescued Daniel. And God loved Daniel. But it's also important for us to remember that God loves everyone. And God doesn't always step in the way that we hope when we're walking in darkness. Sometimes he does, and sometimes he doesn't. And when he doesn't, it's not a reflection of God's love for us. Like we said, God loved Daniel, God rescued Daniel. But let's think about John the Baptist, using another example from the Bible. God loved John the Baptist. Jesus loved John the Baptist. The crowds loved John the Baptist. John the Baptist's birth was a miracle from God. And how does John's life end? Not well. Does the way that John's life ends indicate a lack of love from God to him? Of course not. Could God have intervened in that prison before it happened? Yes. Did God intervene? No. At least not in the way that John or many other people would have hoped. But God loved John the Baptist. Jesus loved John the Baptist. Do you remember how Jesus reacts when he hears the news that his friend and cousin John had died and how he had died? He withdraws by himself in a boat away from the crowds to spend some time processing and grieving. Because Jesus, being fully human, was not immune to basic human reactions and processing such as grief. Jesus loved John the Baptist dearly and went on loving John the Baptist even after John's death. In 2003, my dad was diagnosed with a rare liver disease. And this disease was slowly making his liver shut down. And so everyone that I can remember during that time, I was a senior in high school, I remember the church coming together in a big way and praying for my dad. And there are a lot of people, it was one of those things where we hear of people all over the country praying for my dad. And so he goes down to Jacksonville, Florida, and stays in a hotel room and waits because he's on this liver transplant list. And they say when he gets down there, he wanted to be close to Jacksonville so he could be near the Mayo Clinic. And so when he gets down there, they say, you just stay here in town, and it could be anywhere from 4 to 6 months. But we want you to be really close so that when the liver does arrive, you're able to be here right away. And so my dad was down there, and they said it could be 4 to 6 months, but you need to be here. The second night that he was there, he got a call in the middle of the night and said that they have a liver ready for you. And so my dad got in his rental car. He drove to the hospital right away. And the next later that day, they did the surgery, and it went well. He got his liver, and he was able to have a healthy life after that. Now, the rare disease that he had only, the doctor said it only had a 10% chance of coming back, of recurring. And it did. And so in 2016, years later, my dad needed another liver transplant. And again, he was on the liver transplant recipient list, this time here in the Kansas City area. And it got to the point where he was number 1 on the liver transplant list for his blood type. This time, in 2016, the liver did not arrive in time. And I will never forget the day being in his hospital room with him and other family members when a doctor came in and explained to all of us that he, the doctor, and a board of doctors had decided that my dad's body had become so weak that if they were to attempt a liver transplant, that they would be jeopardizing both him, my dad, and the healthy liver that was going to go into him. And so they were taking him off the liver transplant list and sending him home to hospice. My dad came home to hospice. We spent another 2 or 3 weeks with him. And on June 1st, 2016, my dad passed away. Now, do I believe that God answered prayers in 2003 and stepped in and worked a bit of a miracle in my dad's life in response to everyone's prayers? Yes, I personally believe that. Do I believe that God could have intervened more so than he did, or in a different way than he did in 2016 when my dad needed a liver but didn't get one? Yes. But I don't believe that God loved my dad any less in 2016 than he did in 2003. Not only does God operate differently in different people's lives, we can never pin God down to a formula. That's just not how God works. Not only does he work differently in different people's lives who he loves, he also works differently for each person in different seasons of life. God is not going to be pinned down to some formula that says, if we do this, God will always respond this way. Or if our prayers are righteous enough, God will respond this way because he loves this person. God loves all people. And we can read Psalms like Psalm 121 and Psalm 128 that are full of promises of protection and blessing for righteous people. And you know what? Those are really good, encouraging Psalms. And I love the promises in there. And if you are in a season of blessing in your life, I think you should be thankful for that. I'm thankful for the blessings that I believe are from God in my life. But when we face adversity, what we need to keep in mind is that the adversity we face is never a reflection of a lack of love from God to us. So when we read Psalms like 121 and 128, which are great, let's also balance them with other assurances from Jesus in the New Testament. I want to give a few examples of things that Jesus assured his followers of. Jesus compared the very act of following him, of following Jesus, to taking up a cross. Now, Jesus didn't literally mean that to follow him meant that we literally drag a heavy wooden cross around with us everywhere we go. What he meant is that following him is not going to be easy, and that when we're following him, we're going to know it. Another time, Jesus said to his disciples, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first." Jesus is not shy, and it's upfront that followers of him are going to receive persecution. He mentions this other times too. Also, think about the ominous message Jesus gave to Peter after the resurrection. And Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. And then when Jesus sees Peter again and they have this bit of a reunion, which we kind of read as a happy time sometimes, Jesus asks Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" And Peter is hurt because Jesus asked the 3rd time. And the 3 times that Jesus asks, "Do you love me?" is supposed to parallel with the 3 times that Peter denied Jesus, denied even being associated with Jesus. And so they're having this conversation about love. And it seems good, it seems happy. The headline of that section in our Bible often reads, "Jesus reinstates Peter." And we think of it as a happy time. And then there's this ominous message that Jesus gives to Peter. He says, when you were young, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted to go. But Jesus says to Peter, he says, "I tell you the truth, when you're old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." And then John tells us, it's there in John chapter 21, John tells us, he adds this bit of commentary, he says, Jesus said this to Peter to indicate the type of death by which Peter would glorify God. Jesus often assures people he loves that there are going to be difficult times ahead. Another one, Jesus confronts Saul in a vision on Saul's road to Damascus, on his walk to Damascus. He's going there to continue persecuting Christians. So Jesus confronts Saul. Later on, Jesus appears to Ananias. This is all in the book of Acts. And he says to Ananias, he wants Ananias to go to Saul and lay hands on him because Saul is praying, and he wants Ananias to go and be his messenger. Ananias resists and tells Jesus, "I've heard all these reports about this guy. You know the harm he's done." And what does Jesus say to Ananias about Saul? He says, "Go, Saul is my chosen instrument to carry my gospel." And then he says, "I will show him how much he must suffer for my name." He says to Ananias, "I will show Saul how much he must suffer for my name." Now Saul became Paul, and Paul is the author of the majority of our New Testament. But Jesus' prophecy comes true. Sometime if you want to go on your own and read what Paul writes about in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, you can see that Paul went through a lot of suffering because of his devotion to Jesus Christ. Last example of the time where Jesus assures us that we'll face adversity. There's a time later on in Paul's life when, long after the vision and the Ananias thing, there's a time in Paul's life where he recognizes something in his own life, and we don't know what it is. There's been a lot of speculation, that he describes as a thorn in the flesh, but more so a messenger from Satan. So there's the thorn in the flesh part, which indicates that something deeper than annoying. It's causing him harm all the time. But it's also, he describes it as evil because it's a messenger from Satan and it's tormenting him, this thing in Paul's life, this element of Paul's life. And he says, I pleaded with God 3 times to take it away from me. And which I think is a reasonable prayer. And the 3 times indicates the completeness. He doesn't mean a literal 3 times, but what he's saying more so is, I've pleaded with God in fullness to take it away from me. He's devoted a lot of prayer time to this. And it's a reasonable request. Paul sees this thing as being from Satan, as a source of evil and a source of damage in his life. And what does Jesus say to Paul in a vision? He doesn't say, yes, I'm going to take it away. And he doesn't exactly say no. And he doesn't just not respond. He says, my grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness. Jesus is repeatedly upfront about the way life is going to be difficult for people he loves. What times of darkness, walking in adversity, are never an indication of a lack of love from God to us. I'd like to end this message by sharing some song lyrics. These song lyrics are by one of my favorite musical artists. I've shared many of his songs with you before. The song is called The Silence of God by Andrew Peterson. And it says this, the lyrics say this: it's enough to drive a man crazy. It'll break a man's faith. It's enough to make him wonder if he's ever been sane. When he's bleeding for comfort, when he's bleeding for comfort from thy staff and thy rod, and the heaven's only answer is the silence of God. It'll shake a man's timbers when he loses his heart, when he has to remember what broke him apart. This yoke may be easy, but this burden is not, when the crying fields are frozen by the silence of God. And if a man has got to listen to the voices of the mob who are reeling in the throes of all the happiness they've got, when they tell you all their troubles have been nailed up to that cross, what about the times when even followers get lost? Because we all get lost sometimes. There's a statue of Jesus, he goes on to say. There's a statue of Jesus on a monastery knoll in the hills of Kentucky, all quiet and cold. And he's kneeling in the garden, as silent as a stone. And all his friends are sleeping, and he's weeping all alone. And the man of all sorrows, he never forgot what sorrow is carried by the hearts that he bought. So when the questions dissolve into the silence of God, the aching may remain, but the breaking does not. The aching may remain, but the breaking does not. And the holy, lonesome echo of the silence of God.